1973, hot Florida, the ocean, palm trees, and one strange palace on the shore, Mar-a-Lago, a house that was supposed to become the Winter White House for every president. But that never happened. Half a century later, this building gets a new title: The Entire Story of America's Most Controversial Mansion, Mar-a-Lago. Billionaires and Hollywood stars partied here. Nuclear threats were discussed right on the terrace with an ocean view. A former U.S. president moved in here, in the middle of a club for the rich, and turned his home into a political stage. For some, Mar-a-Lago is a symbol of the dream of wealth and success. For others, it is a place of corruption, scandals, and dangerous secrets. Inside these walls live spy stories, profitable weddings, presidential talks, court cases, and a night FBI raid watched by the whole world. How did one house become a luxury resort, a political battlefield, and a mirror of a divided America at the same time? And most of all, what is Mar-a-Lago really hiding behind its golden gates? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Chapter 1. A Palace Born from Salt and Sand. This story does not begin with the flash of news cameras, federal raids, or political scandals. It begins in silence. It begins with a lone woman standing on a desolate stretch of Florida scrubland, staring at two different bodies of water at the exact same time. The year was 1923. The woman was Marjorie Merriweather Post. Marjorie was not merely wealthy, she was American royalty. Her father, C.W. Post, hadn't just founded a company. He had revolutionized the American breakfast. Through an empire built on grape nuts and Post Toasties, he put a bowl of cereal on nearly every kitchen table from Maine to California. When he passed away in 1914, Marjorie inherited the throne. At 27 years old, she became the wealthiest woman in the United States. By the roaring 20s, she had married her second husband, Edward F. Hutton, a Wall Street titan whose name became shorthand for financial power. Together, they sought a winter retreat, but they didn't want a typical vacation home. They were hunting for a legacy. At that time, Florida was in the grip of a fever dream. The population had nearly doubled in a single decade. Land speculators were trading swamp and sand for fortunes overnight. Palm Beach, a slender barrier island on the Atlantic coast, had already crowned itself the winter playground for the industrial elite. This was where the Rockefellers wintered. This was where the Vanderbilts built. It was a town defined by strict social codes, quiet money, and an exclusivity that made the rest of the country look common. But Marjorie was not interested in fitting into someone else's definition of luxury. She didn't want a mansion on the beach, nor did she want a cottage on the Intracoastal Waterway. She demanded both. The 17-acre plot she secured was geographically impossible for anyone with less ambition. It stretched across the entire width of the island, from the breaking waves of the Atlantic Ocean to the calm waters of Lake Worth, Mar-a-Lago, sea to lake. The name wasn't just a label, it was a statement of dominance. To realize this vision, Marjorie didn't just hire an architect, she hired a collision of styles. For the structure, she chose Marion Sims Wyeth, a Princeton-educated pillar of Palm Beach society known for graceful, restrained Mediterranean revival homes. But for the soul of the house, the interior, she hired Joseph Urban. Urban was not a house builder. He was an Austrian-born stage designer who created massive sets for the Metropolitan Opera and the Ziegfeld Follies. He didn't think in terms of walls and doors. He thought in spectacle. He designed rooms that felt less like a home and more like a theater set, waiting for the curtain to rise. This clash of sensibilities produced something entirely new. It was a beast that had never existed in Palm Beach, perhaps not anywhere in the world. The blueprints were staggering. The plan called for approximately 126 rooms spread across more than 62,000 square feet. It featured a central tower modeled after a Portuguese castle, rising above the tree line like a sentinel. There was a living room where the ceiling was not painted, but smothered in gold leaf. A dining room engineered to seat 36 guests comfortably. There were cloistered walkways, secret gardens, fountains, and loggias that offered views toward every point on the compass. If the design was ambitious, the logistics were a logistical nightmare. Marjorie didn't just buy materials, she plundered history. 3 boatloads of Dorian stone were shipped from Genoa, from the same quarries that had supplied the builders of the Renaissance. 36,000 antique Spanish tiles, some dating back to the 15th century, were collected and shipped to Florida to be embedded into the walls. Artisans were brought in to hand-paint frescoes on the ceilings, while craftsmen carved intricate details into the native coral limestone. The cost was exorbitant. While records from the era are hazy, construction reportedly burned through $7 million. In the currency of the 1920s, that was a fortune. Adjusted for inflation today, the figure climbs into the hundreds of millions. But for Marjorie, the money was irrelevant. Cash was a tool. Her goal was permanence. She wanted to build something that would outlive her, something that would stand as a monument long after the cereal empire was forgotten. Breaking ground in 1924, the construction spanned 3 grueling years. Hundreds of laborers toiled in the oppressive subtropical heat, hauling heavy stone and setting delicate tile in conditions that would break a modern crew. The work demanded an impossible level of precision. Joseph Urban's theatrical interiors required specialists, not general contractors. The application of gold leaf required a steady hand and 0 wind. The integration of fragile, centuries-old tiles into fresh plaster required engineering that bordered on art. By late 1927, the hammering finally stopped. The palace was complete. Marjorie moved in with the satisfaction of a conqueror who had willed a fantasy into reality. The estate functioned exactly as she had dreamed. From the high tower, she could command a view of the ocean to the east and the lake to the west. The gardens erupted in tropical blooms. The courtyards channeled the ocean breeze, and the dining room glowed with the light of unimaginable wealth. However, standing in her finished palace in 1927, Marjorie possessed a blind spot. She could see the Atlantic, and she could see the lake, but she could not see time. She could not know that the world her palace was built to entertain was already living on borrowed time. Within 2 years, the stock market would implode. The Florida land boom, the very economic engine that birthed Palm Beach, would collapse into dust. Across the state, grand estates built in the mania of the 20s would be abandoned to rot or demolition. The parties would end. The lights would go out. Mar-a-Lago would survive the coming darkness. But as the sun set over Lake Worth in 1927, the story of the house was only just beginning. The question wasn't whether the walls would hold. The question was, what happens to a palace when the civilization it was built for ceases to exist? Chapter 2. The Golden Winters. For Marjorie, the answer to the encroaching darkness was defiant luminosity. While other great estates along Ocean Boulevard slammed their shutters closed and let the salt air rot their facades, Mar-a-Lago refused to dim its lights. The Great Depression had arrived, devastating the global economy. But inside those coral stone walls, a different reality persisted. Marjorie Merriweather Post would not allow a stock market crash to dictate her calendar. The winter season of 1929 proceeded exactly as planned. So did 1930 and 1931. The invitations were still engraved on heavy cardstock. The guests still arrived in gleaming Packards, private rail cars, and yachts that anchored in the Lake Worth Lagoon. The parties may have been quieter, the conversations more hushed, but the music never stopped. This was not blindness to the world's suffering. Marjorie was acutely aware of the devastation beyond her gates. She had a massive fortune to protect and thousands of employees depending on her decisions, but she viewed her lifestyle through a lens of duty rather than indulgence. To stop the parties would mean firing the musicians. To close the kitchens would mean starving the staff. To board up the house would mean abandoning the local craftsmen. So, the seasons continued. And in doing so, Mar-a-Lago evolved from a private home into a stage. A typical evening in those years was a master class in atmosphere. It would begin at sunset on the loggia, with guests holding cocktails as the sky bled pink and gold over the Atlantic. Dinner followed in the formal dining room, where 30 or more guests sat beneath a ceiling that had been hand-painted to resemble a Renaissance palace. The candlelight flickered in heavy silver holders, while the conversation drifted from the collapsing banks to the latest art openings. After dinner, the house became a concert hall. Marjorie was a serious patron of the arts, and she treated her living room, with its gold-leaf ceiling and cavernous fireplace, as a performance space. She didn't hire amateurs. She brought in opera stars, chamber orchestras, and dance troupes to perform for an intimate audience of a few dozen people. The guest book from this era reads like a map of American power. Industrial titans brought their wives. Diplomats passed through on their way to Washington. European royalty lived out their exile in her guest suites. Hollywood stars sought refuge from the flashbulbs. Marjorie curated people the way she curated furniture. She wanted interesting minds, and she had the wealth to summon them. But beneath the glamour, the house served a quieter purpose. It became the headquarters for her philanthropy. During the darkest years of the Depression, she funded hospitals, universities, and research expeditions. More immediately, she arranged for food and supplies to be distributed to struggling families across Palm Beach County, often doing so anonymously, ensuring that her charity never looked like a publicity stunt. As the 1930s bled into the 40s, the world broke apart again. World War II transformed Palm Beach. The military requisitioned grand hotels for training barracks. Submarine patrols scanned the coastline for German U-boats. Gas rationing emptied the roads. Yet, Mar-a-Lago adapted. Marjorie hosted events for military officers and threw her energy into war relief, proving that the house could serve the country as well as it served society. Her personal life underwent its own transformation. In 1935, she divorced the financier Edward Hutton and married Joseph Davies, a lawyer and diplomat who would soon serve as the American ambassador to the Soviet Union. This marriage changed the texture of Mar-a-Lago. The house that had been built for parties now hosted intense conversations about international espionage and geopolitics. Marjorie and Davies traveled extensively, and their time in Moscow resulted in a massive influx of treasure. They brought back imperial icons, Fabergé eggs, delicate porcelain, and furniture salvaged from the palaces of the czars. A house originally inspired by Spanish and Portuguese fantasies was now filled with the ghosts of the Romanov dynasty, adding a layer of heavy imperial history to the eclectic decor. By the 1950s, Marjorie was in her 60s. She had divorced Davies and married a fourth time. Husbands came and went, but Mar-a-Lago remained the one constant in her life. It was her anchor, her masterpiece. She continued to entertain, though the pace had mellowed. The post-war boom brought new money and new social rules to Florida, eroding the old formality. Yet Marjorie held the line. In her house, guests still dressed for dinner. The silver still gleamed. The gardens were still manicured to perfection. However, a new anxiety began to take hold. She wasn't worried about her own mortality, but the mortality of the house. She realized that Mar-a-Lago was a dinosaur. It was too vast, too expensive, and too complex for any normal family to inherit. Her children had their own lives. The tax burden alone was enough to bankrupt a millionaire. and the staff required to keep the rot at bay numbered in the dozens. Marjorie had built something magnificent, but magnificence is a heavy burden. She knew that without a specific plan, her beloved palace would eventually be subdivided or demolished. The solution came to her gradually, born from her years as a diplomat's wife. If no private individual could afford Mar-a-Lago, perhaps the nation could. She began to envision her home as a retreat for American presidents, a winter White House, a place where the leaders of the free world could escape the gray chill of Washington to conduct diplomacy under the Florida sun. It was an ambitious, perhaps even arrogant vision, but Marjorie Merriweather Post had never been afraid of arrogance. She prepared to make the offer. The only question that remained was whether the United States government was ready to accept a castle built of sand and gold. Chapter 3: A Gift Nobody Wanted. Washington, however, had no use for castles. Marjorie had spent decades engineering this transition. She didn't just hope for a legacy, she strategized for it. She courted influence, hosted the political elite, and explicitly wrote the United States government into her will. She believed she was handing the nation a crown jewel, a sanctuary where presidents could escape the pressure cooker of the Capitol to negotiate peace treaties under the palms. She died in September 1973, at the age of 86. She lived long enough to watch the aristocratic world of Old Palm Beach begin to crack, but she died with the comforting certainty that her masterpiece was safe. Technically, the government accepted the keys. Mar-a-Lago was officially designated a National Historic Site and a retreat for the Commander-in-Chief. For a brief moment, the dream appeared to be alive. Then, the federal accountants arrived. The reality of operating a 62,000-square-foot palace collided violently with the reality of government budgets. The Secret Service looked at the location, a narrow strip of land trapped between the ocean and the lake, exposed on all sides, and saw a security nightmare. To protect a president, there would require shutting down half the island. The maintenance costs were even more terrifying. The sheer expense of fighting the salt air, staffing the kitchens, and keeping the gold leaf from peeling spiraled into the hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. And that was for an empty house. The presidents themselves wanted no part of it. Richard Nixon already had his own compound in Key Biscayne. Gerald Ford preferred the simpler comforts of the mountains. Jimmy Carter, elected on a promise of modesty, had zero desire to be photographed in a dining room that looked like the Palace of Versailles. The White House quietly concluded that Mar-a-Lago was not a gift. It was a white elephant. By 1980, Congress had seen enough. They authorized the return of the deed to the Post Foundation, the entity managing Marjorie's remaining assets. The government effectively handed back the present. The foundation, now saddled with a money pit, put Mar-a-Lago on the open market. The asking price was $20 million. On paper, it was a fair figure for a property of such scale. But the real estate market of the early 1980s was a graveyard for Gilded Age ambitions. The oil crisis and recession had cooled the lust for mega mansions. The wealthy wanted modern penthouses, not crumbling historic monuments that required a staff of 40 just to open the curtains. Prospective buyers came, they walked the silent halls, admired the ocean views, and then they did the math. They calculated the insurance, the taxes, and the endless repairs. One by one, they walked away. The house began to die. A skeleton crew fought a losing battle against the tropical climate. The guest rooms, once filled with European royalty, smelled of stale air. The dining room gathered dust. Darker rumors began to circulate in Palm Beach. Developers were circling. They didn't care about the history or the hand-painted tiles. They saw 17 acres of prime oceanfront dirt. The plan was brutal but profitable. Bulldoze the mansion, subdivide the land, and pour concrete for luxury condominiums. Preservationists screamed in protest. Although Mar-a-Lago had been designated a National Historic Landmark in 1980, the status was a shield, not a wall. It could delay demolition, but it couldn't stop a determined developer with enough lawyers. The early 80s became a desperate waiting game. The Post Foundation slashed the price. Then they slashed it again. The listing languished. Palm Beach society resigned itself to the idea that the great estate would soon be nothing more than a memory and a pile of rubble. Mar-a-Lago faced a threat Marjorie Merriweather Post had never imagined: irrelevance. It needed a savior. But it didn't just need someone with money. It needed someone with an ego large enough to take on a burden that had scared away the United States government. It needed someone who saw value where everyone else saw ruin. In 1985, that someone landed. He was a brash, 39-year-old developer from New York who didn't care about the polite rules of Palm Beach society. He toured the property and saw an opportunity to brand himself into history. His name was Donald Trump, and from the moment he stepped onto the coral stone, nothing about Mar-a-Lago would ever be quiet again. Chapter 4. The Art of the Deal. Donald Trump saw what others had missed, or perhaps he simply lacked the fear that paralyzed everyone else. Where previous buyers looked at the peeling paint and calculated bankruptcy, Trump looked at the desperate sellers and calculated leverage. The property had been rotting on the market for years. The asking price had plummeted from $20 million to $15 million, and then dropped even further. The Post Foundation was bleeding money, and Trump could smell the desperation in the air. His opening move was an insult wrapped in a business proposal. He offered to buy the antique furniture for its appraised value, suggesting the foundation simply throw in the castle and the land for free. They refused, but the hook was in. What followed was not a polite negotiation, but a siege. It was a years-long campaign of lowball offers, lawsuits, and psychological warfare. Trump discovered that a small strip of beachfront land in front of Mar-a-Lago was not owned by the estate. He quietly bought it for himself. Then he delivered a message to the foundation. If they didn't sell him the house, he would build a hideous concrete block on the beach, permanently destroying Mar-a-Lago's ocean view. He took the war to the press, publicly claiming the mansion was falling apart, driving its perceived value into the ground. The tactics were brutal. They were also effective. In 1985, the siege ended. Trump acquired Mar-a-Lago for a reported price of roughly $10 million. The deal included everything: the house, the 17 acres, and every piece of Marjorie's collection. By conservative estimates, the antique furniture and gold leaf fixtures alone were worth more than the check he wrote. He had essentially bought the contents of a museum and received the palace for free. It was a theft in broad daylight. The man who had stamped his name on the Manhattan skyline now owned the crown jewel of the Gilded Age. The only question remaining was, what would he do with it? At first, he tried to live in it. Trump and his wife, Ivana, used Mar-a-Lago as a private winter residence, resurrecting the lifestyle Marjorie had intended. They threw lavish parties and inserted themselves into the Palm Beach social calendar. But the math remained unforgiving. Even for a billionaire, maintaining a 126-room mansion for a few weeks of vacation was financial suicide. Trump needed a way to monetize the history. His solution was simple: turn the private fortress into a private club. The concept wasn't revolutionary. Grand estates had been converted before, but the execution faced a wall of resistance. The town of Palm Beach was not just a municipality. It was a fortress of old money and strict rules. The neighbors were horrified. They envisioned traffic jams, noise, and the destruction of their quiet, exclusive enclave. The war with the town council dragged on for years. Lawyers filed mountains of motions. Hearings stretched late into the night. Neighbors testified that the noise of helicopters and limousines would ruin their lives. Trump fired back with his signature blend of threats and litigation. But his ace in the hole was social, not legal. He noticed that the established Palm Beach clubs had a dirty secret. They still unofficially excluded Jewish and African American members. Trump flipped the narrative. He announced that his club would be open to anyone who could afford the initiation fee, regardless of race or religion. He framed the town's resistance not as zoning enforcement, but as discrimination. It was a brilliant maneuver. He had outflanked the old guard on their own moral turf. By 1995, the town folded. Mar-a-Lago began its metamorphosis from a private home into a commercial empire. The initiation fee started at $25,000 and climbed aggressively over the years. Members bought access to the historic suites, the spa, the tennis courts, and, most importantly, proximity to power. The silence of the post-Marjorie years was shattered. The polite seated dinners were replaced by something louder, flashier, and distinctly more modern. Charity galas packed the ballroom. Weddings took over the lawns. New Year's Eve became a legendary spectacle, with fireworks exploding over the Intracoastal and paparazzi flashing bulbs at celebrity guests. At the center of it all stood Trump himself. He was not just the owner, he was the main attraction. He would wander through the dining room, shaking hands, posing for photos, and holding court at his reserved table. The club became his stage, and he performed on it every night of the season. Mar-a-Lago was alive again. The dust was gone. The gold leaf was polished. The gardens were manicured to razor-sharp perfection. But the soul of the place had shifted. The house Marjorie Merriweather Post built as a quiet retreat, the house she hoped would be a solemn presidential sanctuary, had become something else entirely. It was no longer a public trust. It was a brand. And for its owner, ruling over a club in Florida was not the ceiling of his ambition. It was merely a rehearsal for a much larger stage. Chapter 5. The Winter White House. The phrase belonged to Marjorie. For decades, she had hallucinated a future where American presidents would gather in her living room, conducting the business of the free world beneath her gold leaf ceilings. Eventually, her vision manifested into reality, though in a form far more chaotic than she ever could have scripted. Donald Trump announced his candidacy in June 2015. He descended a golden escalator in Trump Tower, delivered a speech that set the political establishment on fire, and launched a campaign that shredded the rulebook. Through the turbulence of the election, Mar-a-Lago remained his sanctuary. He flew down on weekends to hold war councils by the pool, plotting his path to power in the very rooms where Marjorie had once hosted polite diplomatic teas. When he won the election in November 2016, the sanctuary was breached. The Secret Service arrived not as guests, but as an occupying force. They surveyed the perimeter, mapped the sniper sight lines, and calculated the vulnerabilities of a palace built for parties, not protection. A sitting president cannot simply vacation at a country club. Almost overnight, the landscape changed. Coast Guard gunboats began patrolling the intracoastal waterway. Temporary flight restrictions turned the airspace above Palm Beach into a no-fly zone. Concrete barricades choked South Ocean Boulevard. The quiet neighborhood that had begrudgingly tolerated Trump the developer now had to survive Trump the commander-in-chief. Mar-a-Lago officially adopted the title Marjorie had coined, the Winter White House. It wasn't just a nickname. Press briefings were held on the manicured lawns. Cabinet secretaries flew down for emergency meetings. Foreign dignitaries arrived for high-stakes summits. The surreal nature of this new era peaked in April 2017. Chinese President Xi Jinping traveled to Florida for a 2-day summit. The leaders dined in the formal dining room, flanked by translators and cameras, discussing the fate of global trade and North Korean aggression within walls originally designed to impress 1920s socialites. But the dinner theater took a violent turn. While the two men ate, Trump ordered a military strike on Syria. 59 Tomahawk missiles launched from Navy destroyers in the Mediterranean, slamming into an airfield halfway across the world. Trump later recounted informing Xi of the attack over dessert, famously describing the moment as happening over the most beautiful piece of chocolate cake. It was a collision of the casual and the catastrophic. It blurred the lines between vacation and statecraft, creating a strange intimacy where foreign policy was conducted while paying club members ate their steaks at nearby tables. Critics were horrified. Mar-a-Lago had effectively become a pay-to-play access point for the presidency. Initiation fees doubled to $200,000 immediately after the election. Members found themselves mingling with defense secretaries. Foreign nationals with opaque agendas could now walk the same hallways as the leader of the nuclear superpower. One specific night crystallized the danger. In February 2017, Trump was dining on the open terrace when news broke of a North Korean missile test. In any other administration, the president would have retreated to a secure situation room. Instead, Trump and his advisors huddled over classified documents right there at the dinner table, using the flashlights on their cell phones to read the intelligence reports. Club members watched in disbelief. Some snapped photos and uploaded them to social media in real time. The officer carrying the nuclear launch codes stood in plain view of the buffet line. The security nightmare was obvious, but the ethical questions were even louder. Was the president monetizing his office? Every weekend trip was a global commercial for his brand. Every news broadcast featured the gilded interiors of his private business. Membership wasn't just about golf anymore. It was about proximity to the throne. Trump waved away the criticism. He argued that he donated his presidential salary, that the property was his home, and that he had a right to work from anywhere. His supporters saw the outrage as partisan hysteria. His detractors saw the corruption of the presidency itself. For 4 years, the club existed in a state of schizophrenia. It was simultaneously a for-profit business and the seat of government. It was a place of leisure and a launchpad for missiles. Then came January 2021. The presidency ended not in a parade, but in smoke and broken glass. Following the insurrection at the Capitol, a second impeachment, and a refusal to attend his successor's inauguration, Trump fled Washington. He flew to Palm Beach on the morning of January 20th, landing hours before his term officially expired. He walked through the doors of Mar-a-Lago not as the most powerful man on earth, but as a private citizen facing an uncertain future. The Winter White House had lost its title, but if anyone thought the story of the house on the sand was over, they were wrong. Chapter 6: Exile and Investigation. The helicopter touched down on the manicured lawn just as Joe Biden placed his hand on the Bible in Washington. The synchronicity was brutal. For the first time in 4 years, Mar-a-Lago was no longer an extension of the Oval Office. The nuclear codes were gone. It was, once again, simply a private club owned by a private citizen with a volatile future. The transition was physical and jarring. One day, the Secret Service controlled every doorway. Coast Guard gunboats sliced through the Intracoastal, and motorcades shut down South Ocean Boulevard. The next day, the bubble burst. The security perimeter collapsed. The airspace reopened. The neighbors, who had spent 4 years complaining about the noise and the checkpoints, were suddenly confronted with something unfamiliar: silence. But inside the walls, Donald Trump refused to fade into that silence. From his private suite, he operated as if the presidency had merely been paused for a commercial break. He did not retire. He established a court. Mar-a-Lago transformed into a government in exile, a shadow White House, where the former commander-in-chief plotted his vengeance. The dining room became a political theater. Photographers snapped pictures of Trump holding court beneath the chandeliers, greeting distinct streams of favor seekers. Republican lawmakers flew down to kiss the ring. Candidates arrived to beg for endorsements. Every dinner was dissected by cable news. Who was at the table? What did it mean for the future of the party? However, while the political spectacle played out upstairs, a quiet legal storm was gathering in the basement. Investigations that had been frozen by the immunity of his office suddenly thawed. Prosecutors in New York began dissecting his business empire. Officials in Georgia opened files on his attempts to overturn the election. But the most dangerous threat to Mar-a-Lago came from the most boring source imaginable: the archivists. The conflict began with cardboard boxes. When a presidency ends, the National Archives takes custody of the record. This is not a suggestion, it is the law. The Presidential Records Act, born from the ashes of Watergate, dictates that the documents of an administration belong to the American people, not the man who sat at the desk. In the months following his departure, the archives realized that history was missing: briefing papers, letters from foreign dictators, notes scribbled in the margins. They were gone. Repeated requests for their return yielded only partial compliance. Boxes trickled back, but officials suspected the bulk of the material remained hidden in Florida. The standoff escalated through 2021 and into 2022. The archives alerted the Justice Department. Subpoenas were issued. High-priced lawyers negotiated in back rooms. In June 2022, federal investigators actually visited Mar-a-Lago to inspect a storage room. They left with a chillingly simple request: put a stronger lock on the door. Then came August 8, 2022. The polite requests ended. FBI agents arrived at the gates not as guests, but as enforcers carrying a search warrant signed by a federal judge. Trump was hundreds of miles away in New York, left to announce the raid himself on social media, framing it as a siege and political persecution. The nation instantly fractured into its usual camps of outrage and applause. But inside the house, the search was methodical. Agents swept through the storage rooms and the former president's office. They hauled away dozens of boxes. When the inventory was finally revealed, it was terrifying. The boxes did not just contain souvenirs. They contained documents marked top secret and sensitive compartmented information. This was material so volatile that even acknowledging its existence could compromise national security. There was intelligence on foreign nuclear capabilities. There were details on military defenses. These were secrets that, if spilled, could get agents killed in the field. Trump insisted he had declassified everything with his mind. His team argued about executive privilege, but the facts on the ground were damning. Highly classified government secrets had been sitting in a ballroom, a bathroom, and a storage closet at a social club where thousands of people came to drink and dance. Mar-a-Lago had ceased to be a home. It was now evidence. A grand jury convened. Witnesses were grilled. Surveillance footage was subpoenaed. In June 2023, the hammer dropped. Donald Trump was charged with 37 federal counts, including the willful retention of national defense information and obstruction of justice. The indictment alleged that this was not accidental. It claimed that boxes were moved and hidden specifically to deceive investigators. The arraignment took place in Miami. Trump pleaded not guilty. His supporters screamed outside the courthouse. His opponents demanded prison time. And at the center of this hurricane stood the House. Marjorie Merriweather Post had built Mar-a-Lago to be a monument that would outlast her, a gift to the American government. She never could have imagined that 50 years later, her gift would be rejected, sold, and finally transformed into the most famous crime scene in American history. Chapter 7. The Case Collapses. For a brief moment on paper, it looked like the end. The indictment didn't read like a legal brief. It read like a spy thriller. Top secret nuclear capabilities stored next to a toilet. Surveillance tapes showing body men shuffling boxes like shell game operators to hide them from lawyers, alleged obstruction, alleged deception, and a betrayal of the oath so brazen that legal experts called it a slam dunk. The evidence wasn't just overwhelming, it was videotaped. But American justice is not a machine. It is a human institution, and humans can be stalled. The case landed on the desk of Judge Aileen Cannon, a Trump appointee with a thin resume and limited trial experience. From the opening gavel, the proceedings hit quicksand. She didn't just preside over the case. She seemed to actively dismantle its momentum. She entertained fringe legal theories that would have been laughed out of any other courtroom. She treated deadlines not as mandates, but as vague suggestions. Trump's defense team understood the game perfectly. They weren't trying to win on the facts. They were trying to murder the clock. They filed motion after motion, challenging the authority of the special counsel, demanding access to classified files, questioning the very definition of a secret. Every motion required a response. Every ruling required an appeal. The machinery of justice didn't just slow down, it ground to a deliberate halt. Meanwhile, the political calendar was ticking. Trump had announced his presidential run in November 2022, just months after the FBI raid. The indictment dropped in June 2023. By early 2024, the Republican primaries were underway. The strategy was clear. If they could push the trial past November, the jury box would be replaced by the ballot box. Could a criminal defendant run for president? The Constitution was silent. The Founding Fathers had apparently never imagined a scenario where a candidate would campaign between court appearances. So, Trump held rallies, raised millions, and crushed his Republican rivals, all while his lawyers fought to keep him out of the witness stand. The trial was originally set for May 2024. It was postponed. A new date was floated, then scrapped. By midsummer, the reality set in. There would be no verdict before the election. Then, the Supreme Court delivered the lifeline. In July 2024, in a separate case regarding the January 6th insurrection, the court ruled that presidents enjoy substantial immunity for official acts. The decision sent shockwaves through the legal system, but Judge Cannon didn't even need the immunity defense to kill the documents case. She found a sharper knife. In a stunning ruling, she dismissed the entire prosecution on a technicality. She concluded that special counsel Jack Smith had been unconstitutionally appointed because he hadn't been confirmed by the Senate. With one signature, she declared the investigation void. Legal scholars were baffled. The ruling ignored decades of precedent from Watergate to Whitewater. The Justice Department vowed to appeal. But appeals take months, and Trump didn't have months. He had voters. In November 2024, Donald Trump completed the greatest political resurrection in history. He won the election. The case died instantly. Under long-standing policy, a sitting president cannot be prosecuted by his own Justice Department. Jack Smith's office was dissolved. The appeal was moot. The boxes of classified secrets, the damning testimony, the surveillance footage, all of it evaporated into the ether. Trump returned to Mar-a-Lago not as a convicted felon, but as the president-elect. The transformation was absolute. The club that the FBI had raided as a crime scene was once again the throne room of American power. Transition meetings were held in the very same library where agents had hunted for stolen documents. Cabinet hopefuls auditioned for jobs beneath the same chandeliers that had witnessed the raid. Mar-a-Lago had survived the investigation. In fact, the scandal seemed to have only hardened its gold-plated armor. For his supporters, the dismissal was proof of righteousness, a victory against a weaponized deep state. For his opponents, it was a dark lesson, that with enough money, enough lawyers, and enough time, you can outrun the law. Marjorie Merriweather Post had built this house with a specific dream. She wanted a winter White House. She wanted a place where the weight of the world would rest on her antique tables. She wanted dignity. She wanted diplomacy. She got her wish, though in the most twisted way imaginable. She couldn't have foreseen the FBI agents, the indictments, or the chaotic spectacle of a former president governing from her dining room while fending off prison. But she was right about one thing. She built a place that mattered. Mar-a-Lago had become exactly what she intended and exactly what she feared, the undeniable center of the American story. And as the motorcades returned to South Ocean Boulevard in 2025, one thing was clear: the house on the sand had won. Chapter 8: Return to Power. The second inauguration bore little resemblance to the first. In January 2017, Donald Trump had arrived in Washington as a tourist in his own capital, a businessman surrounded by advisors who were still reading the instruction manuals of government. In January 2025, he returned as something else entirely. He was a survivor. To his base, he was a martyr who had walked through the fire of impeachments, indictments, and an assassination attempt, only to emerge from the smoke unscathed. Throughout the years of exile, Mar-a-Lago had served as the bunker. The transition team didn't need Washington office space. They operated from the club's gilded conference rooms. Cabinet nominees underwent their auditions in the library, surrounded by first editions. Foreign leaders called to pledge allegiance, their voices ringing out on the same terrace where classified briefings had once been interrupted by dinner service. The club's role in the American experiment was no longer theoretical, it was absolute. This was not merely a vacation home that hosted occasional meetings. It was an alternative capital, a Rome away from Rome, where power concentrated whenever Washington felt too hostile or too cold. Trump had spent 4 years ruling his government in exile from these rooms, and he had no intention of abandoning them now. The Iron Curtain of security slammed back into place. Coast Guard cutters returned to slice through the waters of the intracoastal. The no-fly zone choked the airspace. The neighbors, who had enjoyed a brief, 4-year intermission of relative peace, watched the motorcades return, the helicopters circle, and the protesters gather at the bridge. Palm Beach had not asked to be the center of the geopolitical universe, but geography is destiny. Inside the perimeter, the mood was electric with vindication. The members who had held on to their memberships through the chaotic years now walked with the swagger of investors who had bet on a long shot and won. They had stood by him when the indictments fell. Now, they were the inner circle of the regime. The market responded accordingly. Initiation fees skyrocketed to $300,000, and the waiting list stretched into the horizon. But this second term was not a rerun. Trump returned with a blacklist and a blueprint. The personnel choices reflected a harder, sharper edge. The adults in the room who had restrained him in the first term were gone, replaced by true believers. The institutions that had checked his power, the courts, the intelligence agencies, the Justice Department, were no longer treated as guardrails, but as targets for demolition. Mar-a-Lago became the stage for this restructuring. Policy announcements were broadcast from the ballroom. Executive orders were signed at the same desk where Trump had once reviewed wedding guest lists. The symbolism was deliberate. This was his house, his rules, and his vision for America made manifest in coral stone and gold leaf. Global diplomacy quickly realigned its compass. Ambassadors realized that an official invitation to the White House was ceremonial, but an invitation to Mar-a-Lago was transactional. The informality of the setting, the golf course, the open-air dining room, allowed for the kind of handshake deals Trump preferred. Alliances were not written in treaties. They were formed by the pool. Critics who had screamed about conflicts of interest during the first term watched with exhausted alarm. The ethical firewalls, already porous in 2016, had completely burned down. The club was a business. Members paid fees. Foreign governments booked events. But Trump had won the election because of these conflicts, not in spite of them. His base viewed the monetization of the presidency not as corruption, but as evidence of his business acumen. The infrastructure of the estate evolved to meet the moment. The kitchen, which had served galas for a century, now prepared state dinners on an hour's notice. The staff, once trained in hospitality, were now trained in discretion. Yet as the sun set each evening, the ritual remained unchanged. After the executive orders were signed and the foreign dignitaries departed, Trump would descend to the dining room. He would move from table to table, shaking hands, absorbing the applause, basking in the adoration of his paying audience. The scene was identical to the nights in the 1990s, only now the stakes involved nuclear arsenals. Marjorie Merriweather Post had built Mar-a-Lago as a monument to her own vision of elegance. She had prayed it would one day serve the nation. She imagined quiet diplomacy, gracious entertaining, and presidents escaping the burden of office for a few days of peace in the Florida sun. Instead, she got a fortress. Her home became a symbol of one man's total dominance over the American century. It became a place where power was not just exercised, but performed. The question of whether Mar-a-Lago would shape history has been answered. It has. The only question remaining is what will be left when the current occupant finally departs. Some houses outlive their owners. Some houses outlive their purpose. And some houses become so entangled with the fate of a nation that they can never be separated from it. Mar-a-Lago had become all three. Chapter 9. The People Behind the Palace. History is not written solely by the signatures of presidents or the checks of billionaires. It is also written by the hands that polish the silver. Beyond the breaking news banners and the roaring helicopters, Mar-a-Lago has always relied on an invisible army to function. These are the groundskeepers who arrive in the darkness before dawn to trim the hedges into geometrical perfection. The kitchen staff who endure the heat to plate hundreds of meals in a single night. The housekeepers who smooth the linens in guest suites that cost more per night than the women cleaning them earn in a week. The security guards standing watch for 12 hours at gates they will never be allowed to walk through as guests. Their names do not appear in the history books. Their faces are cropped out of the magazine covers. But without them, the fantasy of Mar-a-Lago would disintegrate within days. This reliance on imported labor is woven into the estate's DNA. In the 1920s, Marjorie Merriweather Post shipped in European craftsmen to execute Joseph Urban's theatrical vision. Italian artisans were brought in to lay the stone. Spanish experts installed antique tiles that had survived centuries, only to find a new home in Florida. Today, the accent has changed, but the dynamic remains. The staff now largely hails from Latin America, Eastern Europe, and the Caribbean. They arrive on temporary work visas, laboring through the high season before disappearing when the wealthy residents retreat to their summer homes. This is the standard rhythm of Palm Beach, an industry of luxury built on the backs of foreign workers willing to accept grueling hours for modest pay. Here lies the great paradox of the Trump era. Donald Trump built a political empire on the promise of America first, vowing to restrict immigration and seal the borders. Yet his own private kingdom was maintained by the very people his rhetoric targeted. Investigations revealed that for years, Mar-a-Lago employed undocumented immigrants, relying on paperwork that managers allegedly chose not to examine too closely. When the scandals broke, workers stepped out of the shadows to speak. They described a life of cognitive dissonance. Long shifts and low wages, punctuated by moments of unexpected kindness from supervisors, all while serving dinner to members who applauded speeches about invaders and criminals. They maintained a palace for a man who publicly questioned their right to exist in the country. Under pressure, the club purged its ranks, shifting to strict electronic verification systems. Longtime employees were quietly let go. Others remained, their papers now in order, but their futures hanging by a thread in a political climate that could turn on them instantly. But the workers are only one half of the ecosystem struggling under the weight of the palace. There are also the neighbors. Palm Beach is a gilded cage, a narrow barrier island, barely 16 miles long and less than half a mile wide. Approximately 8,000 people live here year-round. These are not ordinary citizens. Real estate prices ensure that only the ultra-wealthy survive here. Yet even among the rich, Mar-a-Lago is a source of constant friction. A presidential visit is not an honor for the neighbors. It is a logistical catastrophe. Traffic backs up for miles as checkpoints choke the only roads. The airspace is shut down, grounding private jets. The circus of media vans, protesters, and gawkers turns quiet residential streets into a chaotic spectacle. The tension has spilled into the courts. Neighbors have sued over the noise. They have filed complaints about the motorcades. The town council has spent hours debating whether Trump even has the legal right to live there, citing a 1993 agreement in which he promised that Mar-a-Lago would remain a club, not a private residence. These disputes expose the fundamental conflict of the estate. Mar-a-Lago was built to be extraordinary, to scream its own importance. But it sits in a community that values silence and discretion. Marjorie Merriweather Post understood this delicate balance. She courted her neighbors, supported local charities, and integrated herself into the social fabric. She was a queen, but she was also a resident. The current era has abandoned that pretense. Mar-a-Lago no longer seeks to fit into Palm Beach, it seeks to conquer it. The club's schedule dictates when the bridge opens and when the planes fly. The community is forced to adapt to the estate, never the other way around. Perhaps this is the inevitable cost when a private home mutates into a center of global power. Perhaps a house that hosts nuclear summits cannot be a good neighbor. But that cost is paid in resentment, in lawsuits, and in the slow erosion of goodwill. Tomorrow morning, the workers will return to trim the bougainvillea and scrub the floors. The neighbors will reroute their drives to avoid the Secret Service barricades. And Mar-a-Lago will continue to project an image of effortless, magical luxury, as if the fantasy sustains itself. It does not. It never has. Behind every gold leaf ceiling is a worker on a ladder with a brush. Behind every manicured lawn is a laborer sweating in the midday sun. Behind every state dinner is someone in the kitchen who will never be thanked. That, too, is part of the story. Chapter 10. What the Walls Remember. Every old house keeps secrets. Mar-a-Lago has been hoarding them for nearly a century. If you walk through the main archway today, you pass beneath a ceiling that demanded months of human life to create. The gold leaf was not sprayed on. It was applied by hand, sheet by delicate sheet, in the suffocating Florida humidity of 1926. Some of those artisans left their marks in places no billionaire was meant to see. Initials scratched into the wet plaster, tiny signatures of the anonymous men who built a fantasy they could never afford to inhabit. The house remembers the rhythm of the 1930s. It absorbed the jazz drifting across the loggia and the laughter of guests who danced with the desperate energy of a generation that did not yet know a world war was coming. Somewhere in the architecture, the echoes of those evenings still persist, soaked into the coral stone and the pecky cypress wood. It also remembers the silence. The 1970s brought a different kind of atmosphere, the heaviness of abandonment. The rooms stood empty. Dust settled on Marjorie's imperial collections. The estate suffered the slow, grinding anxiety of a structure with no purpose, waiting to see if it would be saved or bulldozed. Buildings do not have feelings, but they react to neglect. They sag. The paint surrenders to the sun. The jungle creeps closer. Mar-a-Lago came dangerously close to death, and the structure still bears the microscopic scars of that near collapse. Then came the violence of renovation. The 1980s and 90s brought construction crews who drilled into history to install the present. Modern air conditioning ducts were forced through spaces never designed to breathe. Security systems were wired into walls built before the invention of the microchip. Preserving a historic property while forcing it to function as a modern club requires compromise. If you look closely, you can see the junction boxes and access panels that interrupt the original vision. Scars of survival. And the house remembers the intrusion of the recent past. It felt the heavy boots of FBI agents on August 8, 2022. It witnessed the removal of the boxes. It held the strange, pressurized silence that followed, when the entire world was screaming about what happened inside. But the hallway itself was quiet. Buildings absorb tension just as they absorb heat. The stress of that investigation lingers in the air, a static charge that hasn't fully dissipated. Preservation experts know that a house is never just a pile of materials. It is a recording device. Every repair is a paragraph. Every modification is a sentence. The decision to restore a fresco or to paint over it reveals the values of the generation holding the deed. Mar-a-Lago is protected by its status as a National Historic Landmark, meaning the shell must remain frozen in time. The exterior cannot be defaced, the grand rooms must be maintained. The Spanish tiles and Venetian stone are guarded by federal law, but protection is not the same as immortality. A house that is lived in ages differently than a museum behind velvet ropes, and Mar-a-Lago is no museum. It is a combat zone of hospitality. It is a political headquarters, a private residence, and a busy club where hundreds of people walk, eat, and spill wine every week. The wear and tear is relentless. The salt air of the Atlantic does not care about historic significance. The humidity does not respect the price of gold leaf. The termites that swarm South Florida do not distinguish between cheap lumber and century-old craftsmanship. Keeping this palace standing requires perpetual war against the elements, a constant infusion of money and expertise just to hold the line against decay. Some of the original magic has already been lost. When restoration is needed today, modern workers often have to improvise. They match colors and textures as best they can, but they cannot download the muscle memory of a 1920s artisan. Every restoration is an interpretation, a cover song, never quite capturing the soul of the original recording. Even the objects inside tell a fractured story. Marjorie's authentic European antiques now sit beside reproductions and replacements added over the decades. The house has become a mix of the real and the imitation, the historic and the theatrical. It is a layered reality that mirrors the world of its current owner, a place where it is sometimes difficult to tell where the history ends and the branding begins. Architects call this a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been written on, erased, and written over again. The original text is still there, but it is buried under layers of revision. To read Mar-a-Lago, you have to look past the current headlines and see the ghost of the estate that came before. Mar-a-Lago in 2025 is not the home Marjorie built in 1927. It is not the rotting white elephant of 1980, nor the flashy new club of 1995. It is all of those things at once, stacked on top of each other. The walls do not judge the people who pass through them. They simply record. They hold the parties and the raids, the grandeur and the tacky renovations, the state dinners and the secret documents. They have witnessed more American history than any private home has a right to, but the walls cannot tell us what it all means. That interpretation belongs to us, to the living, to the voters, and to the historians of tomorrow. The house keeps its secrets. It stands on the sand, facing the ocean, waiting for the next chapter to be written. Chapter 11. Rising waters. All the political drama, the legal battles, and the historical significance may ultimately be irrelevant, because the final verdict on Mar-a-Lago will not be delivered by a judge, a voter, or a historian. It will be delivered by the Atlantic Ocean. This is the brutal truth that no amount of gold leaf can obscure. The estate sits on a fragile barrier island, barely hovering above sea level, in one of the most hurricane-vulnerable corridors on Earth. The very geography that seduced Marjorie Merriweather Post, that breathtaking view stretching from the ocean to the lake, is also the property's executioner. When Marjorie chose this site in the 1920s, climate change was not a concept. The ocean was scenery. It was beautiful, eternal wallpaper for her garden parties. The idea that the water might rise, that the storms might mutate into monsters, or that the coastline itself might dissolve, would have sounded like cheap science fiction. A century later, the fiction has become a forecast. Palm Beach is already losing ground. Streets that stayed dry for decades now flood regularly during king tides, those days when the moon and sun align to pull the ocean upward. It doesn't even need to rain. Salt water bubbles up through the storm drains like a geyser, spreading across the asphalt, corroding the undercarriages of Bentleys, and destroying the infrastructure from below. The flooding isn't catastrophic yet, but it is persistent. It is a warning. The math is terrifying. According to federal estimates, by the year 2050, sea levels along the Florida coast could rise by another foot or more. By the year 2100, that figure could multiply, depending on how fast the glaciers die. Every single inch of rise translates into more frequent flooding and violent storm surges that eat away at the beaches defining Palm Beach's existence. Mar-a-Lago sits approximately 15 feet above sea level at its highest point. That sounds safe, but it is a deception. A direct hit from a major hurricane pushes a storm surge of 20 feet or higher. You do not need to be a scientist to understand that equation. The warning shots have already been fired. In 2004, Hurricane Francis tore through the county. In 2005, Hurricane Wilma knocked out power to millions and stripped roofs across the island. In 2017, Hurricane Irma forced the evacuation of the entire coast. And in 2022, Hurricane Ian turned Fort Myers, just 100 miles south, into a debris field, killing over 100 people. Mar-a-Lago has weathered these storms so far, but every near miss raises the same question. What happens when the luck runs out? What happens when a Category 5 monster doesn't turn at the last minute? The answer is that money cannot bribe physics. The billionaires of Palm Beach can buy the strongest impact glass and the most advanced pumps in the world, but they cannot build a wall high enough to stop a 20-foot mountain of water. They cannot anchor a building against winds screaming at 150 miles per hour. All they can do is evacuate and pray. Even capitalism is starting to retreat. Major insurance carriers have fled Florida, refusing to underwrite the risk of total annihilation. Those that remain charge premiums that would bankrupt an ordinary millionaire. For Mar-a-Lago, the problem is even more complex. How do you insure a living room covered in 16th century Flemish tapestries against a rising sea? How do you put a price tag on tiles salvaged from a demolished Spanish monastery? The entire town faces an existential crisis. The local economy depends on property values that assume the island will be there forever. The roads, the bridges, the sewers, everything requires constant, expensive defense against the salt. The system only works as long as people believe the fantasy that Palm Beach is worth the risk. So far, the denial is holding. Property values defy gravity. Wealthy buyers continue to bid on oceanfront lots, and construction crews pour concrete for new mansions every day. Each new house is a multi-million-dollar bet that the scientists are wrong. But Marjorie built Mar-a-Lago to be a monument to permanence. She used the finest stone and the hardest wood because she intended for her creation to last 1,000 years. She could not have anticipated that the atmosphere itself would turn against her masterpiece. The house has outlived its creator by half a century. It has survived bankruptcy, divorce, scandal, and political insurrection. It has proven to be an incredibly resilient beast, adapting to every new master. But the ocean does not negotiate. The atmosphere does not care about national historic landmarks or electoral college maps. The physics of melting ice and expanding water proceed without pity. Mar-a-Lago stands where it has always stood, trapped between the sea and the lake, watching the water on both sides. But now the water is watching back, and inch by inch, year by year, it is getting closer. Chapter 12. One House, Two Americas. While the Atlantic slowly swallows the coastline, a different kind of erosion is happening on the street. Stand outside the gates of Mar-a-Lago on any given Tuesday during the season, and you will see the fault line running straight through the pavement. On one side of the asphalt, the true believers gather. They wave flags the size of bedsheets, cheering for the black SUVs, desperate for a glimpse of the man they believe is the only thing standing between freedom and ruin. On the other side, just a few yards away, the resistance gathers. They hold signs calling for justice, jeering at the same motorcades, convinced that the man inside is the architect of the Republic's destruction. These two groups are separated by the width of a road, but they are living in different galaxies. This is what Mar-a-Lago has become. It is no longer just a piece of real estate. It is a Rorschach test made of stone. It is a screen onto which 300 million people project their deepest fears and their wildest hopes. For the MAGA faithful, the estate is the physical proof of the American dream. It represents a man who built a fortune, who gave the middle finger to the establishment, and who captured the throne against all odds. When they look at the gold leaf and the Spanish tiles, they don't see excess, they see victory. They see a fighter who won the prize. For his opponents, the same building is a crime scene. It represents inherited privilege, tax avoidance, and the grotesque intersection of private profit and public office. When they look at the towers, they see a fortress of corruption, a gilded cage for a would-be autocrat. The house itself, of course, is indifferent to these narratives. Strip away the cable news chyrons and the social media rage, and you are left with a machine that just keeps running. It was built by an heiress who wanted to share beauty. It was saved by a shark who saw an undervalued asset. It has hosted genuine diplomatic breakthroughs and witnessed reckless security failures. It employs immigrants who send money home to their families, and it aggravates neighbors who just want their quiet street back. The people passing through the gates are not caricatures. They are club members seeking status, politicians hunting for endorsements, waiters looking for tips, spies looking for secrets. Each person walks into a different Mar-a-Lago, but this nuance is suffocated by the noise. In the current climate, a building is not allowed to be just a building. It must be a weapon. It must be a shrine or a target. Marjorie Merriweather Post died before this polarization tore the country apart. She lived in an America that was divided by race and class, yes, but she believed that institutions would hold. She believed that a house could bring people together. She could not have imagined that her gift to the nation would eventually become the wedge that drove it apart. Today, that optimism feels like an artifact from a lost civilization. The language of politics has morphed into the language of war. Compromise is framed as treason, and Mar-a-Lago sits at the epicenter of the storm, absorbing the lightning. And yet, if you walk the grounds in the early morning, before the cameras set up and the motorcades arrive, the politics dissolve. The bougainvillea is simply beautiful. The architecture is simply impressive. The ocean is simply the ocean, crashing against the seawall with a rhythm that predates the Constitution and will outlast the Republic. The egrets hunting in the shallows do not care who won the election. The humidity does not care about the Supreme Court. The natural world continues its cycle, patient and relentless, waiting for the human drama to exhaust itself. Perhaps that is the only true ending to this story. We see Mar-a-Lago as a symbol of this president or that era, but in the eyes of history, it is just a brief, golden mark on a landscape that was here before us and will remain after us. The indigenous people who fished these waters did not imagine a palace. The Spanish explorers who mapped this coast did not imagine a political rally. And we cannot possibly imagine what the people who come after us will see when they look at these ruins. The house will mean whatever we decide it means. But we are not the last to decide. Chapter 13. What Remains? We are not the last to decide the meaning of this place, but we may be the last to remember what it actually felt like before the mythology took over completely. Somewhere in a climate-controlled storage facility, or perhaps gathering dust in a university basement, there are boxes of photographs from Marjorie's era. They are black and white windows into a vanished civilization. Women in silk gowns descending the main staircase. Men in dinner jackets clustered on the loggia. Cigarettes burning, with the dark Atlantic churning behind them. Servants in stiff uniforms carrying silver trays through courtyards that look exactly as they do today, minus the surveillance cameras and the panic buttons. These images capture more than just fashion. They capture a lost framework of reality. The people in those frames possessed a terrifying confidence. They believed in progress. They believed that wealth, if properly managed, could beautify the world. They believed that America was ascending, and that houses like Mar-a-Lago represented the apex of human achievement. Some of that belief was naive. Much of it was self-serving. But it produced something undeniably real, a structure of extraordinary craftsmanship built with materials we can no longer source and techniques we can no longer replicate. The hands that carved the Mar-a-Lago stone are dust. The artisans who applied the gold leaf to the curved ceilings, who set the antique tiles into the wet plaster, they are gone, and they took their secrets with them. That specific knowledge has become an endangered species. When restoration work is needed today, specialists must be flown in from across the globe. They study the original work like archaeologists, analyzing the chemistry of the paint, trying to reverse engineer the genius of 1927. Sometimes they succeed, but often, to the trained eye, the repairs look like what they are: expensive imitations. We are a generation of maintenance, trying desperately to hold together a world we no longer know how to build. This fragility is the hidden truth of the estate. The house was built as a fantasy, an escape from the ordinary. But maintaining a fantasy requires a war against entropy. The moment the money stops flowing, the decay begins. Salt air eats the iron. Humidity warps the wood. Insects consume the structure from the inside out. Time dismantles everything. Marjorie understood this war. She employed a legion of staff whose only job was to hold back the inevitable. Donald Trump understands it too. His maintenance crews work not just for preservation, but for presentation, polishing the stage for the cameras that broadcast his image to the world. But what happens when the cameras finally turn off? What becomes of Mar-a-Lago when the man whose name is synonymous with the property is gone? The club could continue, of course. The wealthy will always hunt for exclusivity, and Palm Beach will always have a market for overpriced galas. It is entirely possible that Mar-a-Lago could revert to its original purpose, a beautiful, quiet venue for the social rituals of the rich, stripped of its political radioactive decay. Or it could become a museum of its own strange history. Imagine school groups touring the library where cabinet nominees were interviewed. Imagine exhibits explaining the construction techniques of the 1920s, alongside the political insurrections of the 2020s. The house could become an educational artifact, its meaning finally fixed by curators rather than by voters. Or it could face the darker timeline that nearly claimed it in the 1980s. The insurance costs could become suffocating. The rising sea levels could scare off the buyers. The sheer burden of maintaining a 126-room dinosaur could prove too heavy for anyone but a government to bear. History tells us that houses do not last forever. The great mansions of Newport turned into museums, the palaces of Europe transformed into hotels, the plantations of the South became battlegrounds over memory. Nothing built by human hands is immortal. Mar-a-Lago will join this procession. The only question is what we will remember when it does. Will we remember Marjorie, standing on the empty sand in 1923, dreaming of a castle? Will we remember the anonymous immigrants who built that dream? Will we remember the parties, the FBI raids, the nuclear codes at the dinner table, and the moments when this single building seemed to contain the entire American story? Or will we remember only the noise, the arguments, the divisions, and the endless conflict that made the house famous while obscuring its soul? The people in those black and white photographs cannot answer us. They show us their faces but not their thoughts. They are gone, and we cannot ask them what they hoped would survive. Someday we will be the ones in the photographs. We will be the frozen images that future generations study. They will look at us, at our red hats and our protest signs, at our phones and our anger, and they will wonder who we were. They will wonder why we fought so hard over a house on the sand. And by then, the walls will be the only ones who know the truth. Chapter 14. The Ghosts of What Could Have Been. We often mistake survival for inevitability. We look at the stone towers and assume they were always destined to stand. But Mar-a-Lago is not just a building, it is a survivor of 1,000 near misses. The estate is haunted, not by spirits or specters in white sheets, but by possibilities. The house carries the crushing weight of every path not taken, every alternative timeline that flickered for a moment and then vanished into the dark. These ghosts are invisible, but they shape the present just as surely as the foundation Marjorie poured. First, there is the ghost of the winter White House that never was. Marjorie's original will was a blueprint for a different America. She imagined presidents arriving not as owners of a private club, but as humble guests of the people. She saw diplomacy conducted in rooms dedicated to public service, not commercial profit. She imagined the house as a national gift, free and open. That timeline died in the 1980s, suffocated by federal budgets and short-sighted bureaucracy. But the ghost of that public trust remains, whispering about a version of history where this palace belonged to everyone. Then there is the ghost of the wrecking ball. In the early 80s, developers circled Mar-a-Lago like vultures sensing a kill. They looked at the hand-carved stone and saw nothing. They looked at the 17 acres of oceanfront dirt and saw gold. The plan was simple: bulldoze the history and pour concrete for a subdivision of luxury condos. The destruction came terrifyingly close. The house stands today only because the math of demolition didn't quite work out. The ghost of those unbuilt condominiums lingers on the lawn, a chilling reminder of how easily beauty is sacrificed on the altar of a quick profit. There is the ghost of the prosecution that was silenced, the indictment, the mountain of evidence, the parade of witnesses, all of it assembled with painstaking care, only to dissolve before a verdict could be read. Regardless of guilt or innocence, the collapse of the case left a hole in the historical record. Was the retention of nuclear secrets careless or criminal? Was the obstruction real or imagined? The legal system never finished the sentence. The ghost of that untaken verdict haunts the storage rooms, a permanent reminder that justice delayed can eventually become justice erased. There is the ghost of the marriage that imploded here. Donald and Ivana divorced in 1992, their war playing out in tabloids and courtrooms. But before the end, Ivana was the architect of the club's glamour. Her taste defined the early era. Her presence managed the social currents. When she left, she took a specific energy with her, a version of Mar-a-Lago that existed only when they were a power couple. That ghost walks the halls in high heels, reminding us that houses absorb the relationships of the people who live in them. And finally, there is the ghost of Marjorie herself. Not literally, but morally. Her intentions hover over every dinner service and every political rally. What would the serial heiress think of the red hats, of the FBI agents rifling through her drawers, of the protesters screaming at her gates? The dead do not speak. Even if they could, their judgments would belong to a vanished world. Marjorie lived in an era where wealth whispered, where privacy was sacred, and where the line between business and politics was drawn in permanent ink. She cannot tell us if she approves of what her masterpiece has become, but the building speaks for her. The craftsmanship screams that excellence matters. The sheer scale insists that ambition is a virtue. The failed gift to the nation argues that private wealth has a duty to serve the public good. These are not partisan messages. They do not belong to a political party. They are values embedded in the coral stone and the antique tiles, waiting for anyone willing to listen. The current chapter of Mar-a-Lago's story is loud. It is contentious. It dominates the news cycle and splits families at the dinner table. But we must remember, this is only one chapter. The house existed before the headlines, and it will exist after they fade. The ghosts of other possibilities walk these corridors to remind us that nothing is written in stone. Choices were made. Different choices could have led to a different world. This is the strange power of the place. The past is fixed, but our understanding of it is fluid. The Mar-a-Lago of the year 2050 or 2100 will be a different creature than the Mar-a-Lago of today. Its meaning will be reshaped by whatever happens next. The house holds all these timelines within its walls, the realized and the unrealized, the celebrated and the mourned. It is a repository of American dreams, some fulfilled, some betrayed, all of them trapped in the amber of history. The ghosts do not rest. They never do. They simply wait for us to notice them, to acknowledge the fragile nature of our reality. And in that noticing, we find a warning. We remember that the future is not inevitable, that choices still matter, and that the ghosts of tomorrow are being created by the decisions we make right now. Chapter 15, Last Light on the Terrace. The ghosts have had their say, but tonight the sun is setting, and Mar-a-Lago is doing the only thing it has ever truly mastered, surviving in style. The light drops low over the intracoastal waterway, bruising the sky in shades of amber and violent rose. The palm trees cast shadows that stretch across the lawn like the hands of a clock. Somewhere inside the service corridors, the machine is waking up for another night. Silverware clinks against china. Napkins are folded into precise geometries. Surfaces that have been polished 10,000 times are polished once more, preparing to reflect the faces of the powerful. This ritual has performed itself every single evening for nearly 100 years. The angle of the sun, the humidity in the air, the shift from the brutal afternoon heat to the velvet cool of twilight. Marjorie Merriweather Post stood on this terrace and watched it. Her wealthy guests watched it between sips of Prohibition-era cocktails. The laborers who hauled the stone in the 1920s watched it, wiping sweat from their eyes. and whoever holds the deed 100 years from now will watch it too, assuming the coral stone still holds, and assuming the island still keeps its head above the rising tide. There is something deeply humbling about this continuity. The political dramas that strangle the cable news cycle, the investigations, the elections, the outrage, all of it is recent, and all of it is temporary. The sunset is older than the Republican Party. It is older than America. It will continue long after every argument started in this dining room has dissolved into silence. That does not mean the arguments are trivial. They are not. The decisions made beneath these chandeliers have altered the trajectory of millions of lives. The policies brokered on this terrace have shifted global borders. The secrets stored in these bathrooms carried the weight of national security. History here is not a textbook abstraction. It is a contact sport, lived by human beings who celebrate, suffer, and struggle to bend the world to their will. But history is also long. It is longer than any presidency, longer than any scandal, longer than any winter palace, no matter how much gold leaf you apply to the ceiling. Mar-a-Lago serves as a mirror for the American experiment, whether we like the reflection or not. It shows us how wealth creates its own gravity. It demonstrates how symbols can fracture a nation just as easily as they can unite it. It reveals the eternal tension between public interest and private property, between the past we inherit and the future we are trying to survive. These tensions will never be fully resolved. They are the permanent features of a nation that promised both liberty and equality, two forces that are often at war. Every generation confronts this paradox anew. Every generation finds its own uneasy truce. The House will stand watch as the next generation finds theirs. For now, the light fails completely. The sky turns from gold to purple, then to a heavy tropical black. The stars emerge, the indifferent stars that shone over this coastline before the Spanish galleons arrived, before the railroad came, before the name Mar-a-Lago was ever spoken. The security floodlights click on, a sharp, modern intrusion into an ancient rhythm. Inside, the music starts. Outside, the ocean continues its patient grinding work, advancing and retreating, shaping the shore grain by grain. Mar-a-Lago endures, changed, contested, celebrated, and condemned, but still here, still watching the dark water, still waiting to see what happens next. The story is not over. The story is just turning the page.